They're always going to do it. There's always going to be that percentage. This story is perennial. We'll still be talking about it in 30 years, about the person who's just flashed his balls out the back of a bus. It's going to be happening in the year 2035.
Anna, you wrote a great piece in the Monthly about Kim Duthie, the 16-year-old schoolgirl who posted nude photos of St Kilda footballers on the internet. She claimed that she was pregnant to one of them, and this led to further scandals involving the AFL, the police, allegations of misconduct by older men who should know better, etc, etc. Some people might see her as simply a girl who acted badly, but you think her story symbolises, I think, a much broader malaise. Why did Kim Duthie in this episode interest you?
To begin with, she reminded me of me when I was 17. She reminded me of a 17-year-old who had probably been quite good at school, quite good at sport, and then suddenly gone off the rails and was a bit of a time bomb. And I felt for her. And, you know, she was walking around with a duffel bag and estranged from her parents. And I was pretty similar when I was 17. I was a bit of a mess. So to begin with, I kind of felt like I understood her situation. My last 2 years of high school, I went to a school that was becoming 50-50 boys and girls. But I was only one of 10 girls in my year, so there were 120 boys. So to me, it felt like a really familiar scenario made massive of this girl who seems to be really confident but has been exploited and is not even quite sure why she's angry, but she's angry. So I felt for her. But at the same time, I think there's something about being 17 that's quite unlikable when you're an adult, and I think I was probably quite unlikable when I was 17. And she's got a lot of elements that made people angry, and people wanted her to just shut up and go away. So I was attracted to Kim for that reason, but my attraction started to wane a little as I met her, and I spoke to her on the phone a couple of times, and I sort of started to realise that she was not so much the story, she was a symbol of something much bigger. It wasn't about her, it's why did people want her to smash the AFL? Why were so many people behind her and barracking for her to smash the boys' club at AFL? So I began to think of her more as, why were people using her as a weapon?
Anna said she identified with Kim Duthie. Most of us didn't identify with it, but there was still a lot of newspapers being sold. What was it about this story? It's like a cocktail of elements, but what in particular do you think made this one become such a scandal? Well,
this story really is tabloid perfection. You're looking at sex, drugs. As Anna said, you've got an older man maybe sleeping with a younger girl, and you've got the national obsession, or at least the obsession in the southern states in football. And then that gets blown up by the fact that there's this whole question of new media and whether new media empowered a formerly powerless person to take on the establishment. And so, as the piece kind of brilliantly addresses, it not only is the time honoured clash between kind of the power that is the AFL Football Club and the boys' club of footy. And this really has been going on forever. The same kind of exploitation was going on with players in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s. It's not like this is new, but what is new is that someone found a way, and Kim Duthie found a way. And so the media was fascinated with that. The old media is fascinated with the fact that someone would find a way to have their voice heard and to tear at this establishment. And she did it in a spectacular way, like in quite a conniving way. And so the story is brilliant. It's the best tabloid story of the year.
It perfectly tapped into the dual cultures of AFL football at the moment, one being the progressives, because it was a woman fighting back, and she was fighting back against the traditionalists, the Sam Newmans of this world, who said from the beginning she's really just a troublemaker, she's a stray like all the others. Do you think the next scandal will be any different, that we've learnt anything from this?
Have we learnt anything
Well, the
from
players
this?
will have. Like the players will have, and they'll be being drilled in it. And I guess there won't be naked footy trip photos being taken. There will be pregnancy tests being asked for as evidence before clubs make statements on that sort of thing. Like there'll be fallout in terms of the protective mechanisms the clubs put up. And the clubs have been brilliant at protecting their players. I mean, the Four Corners story of 4 or 5 years ago where a Sydney player and a Port Adelaide player were accused of raping a woman in a park, and hundreds of thousands of dollars were paid to this woman. And that's the sort of power the clubs have had, and their willingness to put up the walls, and the success they've had at blocking the really, really sensational claims that could ruin their clubs and their players. But this time they didn't do as well.
What did they do wrong this time? Like what?
I don't know. I'm not entirely sure how they could have dealt with it better. Obviously, St Kilda, coming out and saying they were going to, sue her for 15 years of her life was not a good move. But how do you deal with a girl who says she's pregnant when she's not? How do you deal with that? And how do you deal with a girl who I think was really vulnerable, really competitive and really angry and unable to articulate why? How do you deal with that? I don't think they were prepared to go there with her. I think she was asking for them to take responsibility, and the only way she could articulate that was to lie, to say I'm pregnant, because that was the only visible way she could convince them that they needed to take responsibility for her. Yeah. But it was actually, if she was older, she might have been able to say it better. It was more a political statement than, she'd made it personal, but it could have been political.
Yeah. But there is still, to some extent, a truth in her situation that she was mistreated in those initial instances by football players. Possibly it was just that she misread signs. Nevertheless, she had sex with and put herself in a situation with football players that they took advantage of. She was young. Do you think that the football players themselves need to look at their own behaviour in relation to her?
Well, I don't know how young she was. I mean, you've only really got the law to go by. I mean, in this situation, if you start saying, if it was legal, I mean, who are we to say that what sex footballers have is more wrong than the sex non-footballers have, and is it a societal problem? If there was no law broken and it was consensual sex and there's an age of consent, and if she was over it, then I sort of think. In some respects, the issue with this girl is she's not alleging a sexual assault or a rape. Then it's not like this particular case is out of control. Is there a general problem with footballers and women? Yes, there is, and there always has been. It's not, and as I said, like this is and the AFL's trying really hard to do something about it. And maybe it's slightly worse because they have so much time on their hands and don't have professional lives outside of football. I mean, for so long, and David Parkin's a great advocate of this idea that footballers need to have education or a job in order to dilute the amount of time they have to spend with themselves and their fame and their money and their fans, because that creates a false reality for a footballer. And so maybe you could argue that they need to get back to being, well, they're not going to be plumbers as well as footballers anymore, like Michael Tuck was, but maybe they need to be doing a teaching degree while they're a footballer. And suddenly they might meet a whole lot of other teachers, and suddenly they go into a school and they teach a bit, and you get that element of balance in life. And so maybe that is some sort of reason to say things are getting worse, but they're not getting much worse. They've always been really bad in the relationships between people that are famous and rich and full of themselves. And I'm speaking from the point of view of someone who was on a league list. I was there as well. And I know the feeling of feeling kind of bulletproof and fit, and you basically you're in the prime of your life. That sort of feel. I'm sure the players feel that at 21 and 22. That's what leads to the general mistreatment of the women that hang off them.
But is there something inherent in that feeling of bulletproof and being a male and being a football player? Why is it that it always seems to impact on young women?
I think because I read somewhere, or someone who was trying to teach me to write said there's only three things that humans need, and that's food, shelter and sex. And so the sex drive is in that elemental 1/3 of our being or more, in terms of what people think about whether they are exploitative, whether there's a culture of sexism and a culture of degrading women. I think that yes, there probably is, and what it comes from is a lack of women in their environment. And so, every 22-year-old guy is thinking about sex. But maybe the 22-year-old guy who's doing the teaching degree isn't thinking as exploitatively or as demeaningly towards women, because women are a natural part of his life, and they're not fan women. They're not women who come up and gush all over them in a pub. They're women who they have to do an assignment with next week, and so you kind of create this real world of women.
Yeah. This is really the problem, isn't it, with the culture generally? It's that when you look at the television and you're looking at the television coverage or the shows around it, the women are either told to not participate, like Kelly Underwood, who was removed basically, or
she was annoying.
Because she was annoying, or Caroline Wilson, who goes on that show on Monday night and seems to put up with incredible condescension, even though she's probably the best journalist on football in the country. She puts up with that. You have to think there's not very many female figures that are allowed to participate in the world of football.
Like you get the sense of, in the football world, women are service providers. I mean, you've got your mum who drives you to and from training and makes sure you eat carbohydrates before. You've got physiotherapists, but they're all working for these guys. They're massaging them, they're looking after their hamstrings. Or you've got PR who they're moulding their image. You've got dietitians who are micromanaging their diets. Everyone's working for them. Even so, when you go to a bar, they're still a service provider because they provide sex, and they also provide like one-upmanship for each other, a bit of bonding. So they're never. So when you try and get women on an equal footing, it can create resentment among the sort of misogynist vein. You've got the women as directors and board directors, and you saw quite obviously on Sam Newman on the Footy Show said quite bluntly that I don't think they have a place on boards in football. I don't think they have a place here. He said it really bluntly, and I don't think he was the only one who has that opinion. Yeah. So woman is, and I think that's what Kim Duthie, I don't think she ever realised before, until this interaction and scenario. I think it was the first time she realised the limitations of her sex. I think it was the first time she realised that she couldn't be on the team. And I know that sounds really theoretical and academic or anything, but I think it wasn't just about her wanting to sleep with footballers. She thought she was an equal, and then she realised she wasn't. And I think she was really surprised and really shocked and really angry. Because she was a champion athlete. She was a top runner, she was a state champion. And suddenly she realised that she was lesser. And I think that came to her as a real shock to her. I don't think she had thought about it before. And I think she reacted badly. But I don't know how women can become equal in the world of football, because women will never go onto the oval and play in front of huge amounts of roaring fans.
Yeah. AFL, more than I think almost any other team sport, attracts a huge proportion of women attending the games and watching on TV. It's interesting to think about it in this context. That's why there's these
contradicting notions within AFL. That's why it's really interesting, because it sells itself as this local, grassroots, family game. It's not rugby. It hasn't got cheerleaders. It hasn't got sequin little bras and tight shorts, pom-poms and all that kind of stuff. It is probably the most appealing male sport to females. And it's fun. It's a good game. I'm not a footy hater. I actually quite enjoy it. But I think it's that's why it's so important to women, and that's why it's so important for it to become more and more progressive, because it needs to keep that element. That's what makes it slightly different to rugby, I think.
And can I also say that like we're focusing on the fraction of a percent of footballers that have issues that make the papers, and really overwhelmingly in a group of 600 or 700 players, that they behave. You know, they've got working relationships, and they're not trawling bars, and they're not having gangbangs, and whatever does make the papers. There's whole group of footballers who watch an interview like this and go, "What about us? You know, I'm not gangbanging." And
I think it's a small percentage, but at the same time, I mean, no good news ever makes the papers.
No, that's right.
So it's a small percentage, but that doesn't mean. And I think there's obviously that tabloid element of it's all footballers are like this, and I think most people know that they're not. But I also don't think this is. I think this is a culture that goes down to the minions as well as to the top players. If you look at community clubs, you've got your pie and porn nights, you have strippers for your and I write about it in the essay. This guy had the downlows for his community football club, which was their equivalent of the Brownlows. And to win the download, you had to do the most debauched thing on a footy trip. Yeah. And those things are pretty ugly. So I think it's not so much AFL, but it's a culture, and I think that exists in ice hockey, and I think it exists in a lot of male aggressive sports. And I think that's why it's interesting.
There's no doubt about it. I'll give you examples. You know, I was I was a part of one club that had a thing called a camel club, and that was where you had to invite two girls who weren't your wife or girlfriend to a night, so there would be an outnumbering of women to men by 2 to 1, and they weren't allowed to be your wife or girlfriend. I mean, that's an idea that someone. I was only in my early 20s at that club, but that's an idea that's been thought up, and it's it's exactly the cultural problems that you're talking about. And another club, I was the youngest player on a footy trip, and so I was designated queen of alcohol, and was dressed up in shaving cream and toilet paper to present the alcohol to the older guys on the football club, nude with those photos exist. Kim Duthie, if you get that, there goes that becomes my number one Google image search for the rest of the time. So and that's the brutal thing that she did, is that she, I think, has had a serious impact on the life of Nick Rewalt and Nick Del Santo in a ruthless, brutal act against those two people who, I don't know if they've done anything to her, but there's been no allegation publicly that they've done anything to her, and she has apologised to them now. But the release of that photo has a lifelong impact on those two people, and I think it was reprehensible.
I don't think it was reprehensible. I think that very few people mentioned that was a response to a viral email that went around to much of Melbourne, to the AFL Players Association, to lawyers, to cops, to players, former and present players, which had a photo of her and the Saints girl written underneath it, and it also had a poster of 2 men and a baby, or 3 men and a baby, and had photos of the footballers' faces photoshopped onto the poster. Okay. I think her reputation was ruined, and she wanted to ruin reputation as well. And very few, if any, commentators made that link, that hers was a response to that viral email. She used the same font that viral email used. And she says quite clearly, I wanted them to feel how I felt. Yeah. And this was before people knew her name. This was before people knew what she looked like. And this photo was sent all around Melbourne. Yeah. A lot of people in Melbourne received that email, and a lot of people laughed, who was supposed to be acting responsibly. So I think that Melbourne became her schoolyard, which was a really intense thing for a 17-year-old, and then the internet became her schoolyard. And I think Rewalt could probably survive. I'm not sure. I worry more for her future than Rewalt's at the moment. Not because I like her and I don't like Rewalt. No, I don't even know if I like Kim Duthie, but I do worry because when you're 17 and this stuff happens, what chance do you have to evolve to put it behind you? Whereas Rewalt, he's a bigger guy.
I worry more for her future as well because I think she's got personality issues that have resulted in this behaviour. Rewalt, other than dressing up naked in the same way as I did as the Queen of Alcohol, you can argue that's pretty foolish, and that maybe that you might talk to me about his personality issues, but I don't think he's behaving antisocially. At least there's been no public evidence of that. And I think she has behaved antisocially, and therefore I think I am more worried about her because I worry what that means for her mentally and where she is and how you deal with these big bursts of fame and is she ambitious for more fame or is she going to feel spat out when this burst ends? I personally think she'll be on Getaway within 6 months. But,
totally. Getaway?
That's
quite a high standard, I think.
She'll be embraced by the commercial networks as
definitely.
As a personality and a face because she's pretty and she's obviously very dynamic and she's ambitious to be
She's got a good grasp of technology.
So I'm pretty sure that we haven't heard the last of her, put it that way.
Do you think anyone will ever ask at any point in this journey why naked guys were taking photos of each other semi-aroused? Is that?
I think a lot of people have asked, and I think something's been suppressed. I think there's quite a lot of rumour and innuendo about the before story.
I'm not implying anything about. I don't kind of particularly care about their individual sexual orientations, but it was a very homoerotic act, and everyone. I think the media failed to address it because they thought it's almost more litigious or more vilifying to say something like that about a football player.
Were they semi-aroused? I'm sorry, I missed the. That I didn't get that sense from that photo. As a general response to the idea that this nakedness, this parading around that goes on in football clubs undoubtedly does. They do it in front of the female members of staff. They do it in front of anyone who comes into the football club will be presented with naked male bodies. And there's a general sense, I think, from people who aren't in football clubs that implies homoeroticism and suppressed homosexuality, and I really disagree with that.
I do too.
I think that there's that you can really argue that there's problems with the way footballers deal with women, but the way that footballers deal with each other is naked. Like their job requires them to be naked with each other every day, and so there comes to be a comfort with that. There probably comes to be a certain sense of pride with it. They've all got amazing bodies, and so they also spend a lot of time in this kind of boisterous one-upmanship type of mode. And when you combine the one-upmanship and the boisterousness and the competitive gag making, if you like, with nakedness. What the outside world will see is homoeroticism.
Right. Yeah. So you think the photos were simply a symptom of a joke gone wrong?
I don't know what the photos were, and it's obvious that they're in a group of men of that size. There's going to be some gay men, but I think that it's generally oversold. That this is that what we're seeing in that football world is a whole lot of homoeroticism and suppressed homosexuality. Because I think if anything, homosexuals would balk at the football world.
I think so, and I think they'll be just as nervous as a lone female amongst it.
Yeah.
I think there's a culture of pranks and humiliation that, on a really light level, it's fun. It's kind of gorgeous. I mean, I remember watching one of Favola's teammates, hiding behind a seat when Favola was coming off the oval and go, boo! And it's cute. And you laugh at that. It's funny. And then that can degenerate into some really ugly pranks. And you're like, okay, so there's no boundary here between laughing at someone's humiliation and a pecking order that might be established by these just having fun gags. And I mean, the Footy Show was a prime example of that. Sometimes they're funny, sometimes they're wrong, they're off, and they go too far.
You're very kind to give them the sometimes they're funny.
Well, sometimes, you're right.
No, but I know what you mean. Yeah.
But I know sometimes you can't take away that element they're walking a really fine line at the moment between this progressive, politically correct element moving forward, or we've got this blokey, macho, misogynist element, and somewhere there needs to be a middle ground. Because I think it's ridiculous that Matthew Richardson will get fined $2,000 for flipping the bird.
Yeah.
Big deal. It's not a big... Or when Ben Cousins flips the bird to a TV camera in the change room, he gets fined $5,000. No one says, why the hell is there a TV camera in the change room? Surely there's a sense of voyeurism that's going too far here. But then you have really horrific pranks, which is, Sam Newman stapling Caroline Wilson's face to a dummy and saying, oh, she's a fair piece, Caro. Yeah. And you know what that is. And he says that's a male compliment, but you know what he's doing. He's shuffling the power dynamic.
Well, you could argue that, but and he certainly is doing that. But I think what they're really doing is another stage scandal. And my first novel, Players, was set in the world of AFL football media, and in particular a show that was very like that show. And basically they script poor behaviour for ratings slumps and for the beginning of each year. So there's the Nicky Winmar thing will happen, at a point where they need a front page from the Herald Sun, and they need to be the talking point on 3AW for the week. And and that's how we're played now as a public. That this kind of moralising and this outrage that the community generates towards these people who want to outrage, because it's how they sell bourbons, which whoever's sponsoring the show. It's kind of a pillar of money at the footy show that is generating this kind of crass debate. And we're here having, I think, quite a non-crass debate about it. But it's still the upshot of what everyone wants, what the media wants, is this debate.
Definitely. And we've been played to a T, really.
We've been played to a T, fortunately.
I just want to finish off. There was one really interesting moment that you raised in the last paragraph of the essay. You talk about how Chris Judd, at his Brownlow medal speech, he slipped for a moment when he said, it's all make-believe what we do. It's like a fantasy. We get out there and we can act out and people buy into it. And he said something about what real people like Jim Stein, people do in the real world. And there was a moment where the audience they paused and then they quickly jumped in to clap. Like they actually didn't quite know how to respond, because he actually was drawing attention to a fundamental truth, I think, about football playing, which is it is all make-believe. And to some extent we invest in them and we make the players the pawns that we want them to be, for better or worse. We want them to play up occasionally. Other forces want them to be good and nice, liberal, sensitive boys.
He's said a few amazing things. He has said not only that sentence, he's also said we're not role models. He got bucketed for that.
Well, that's the question that I sort of wanted to finish on.
We're not role models. Find other role models. We're footballers. And he's exactly right. Some of them aren't role models. Jim Steins is a role model. I think Chris Judd is a role model because he has the insight into his world to make those two statements. But there's a whole lot of them that are just good at playing football, and it's the job of society to be able to say, not to pull down the people that aren't role models, not to spill all of our ink and put all of our airtime into bucketing these people and saying, how come you're giving this impression to children? They're always going to do it. There's always going to be that percentage. This story is perennial. We'll still be talking about it in 30 years, about the person who's just flashed his balls out the back of a bus. It's going to be happening in the year 2035. And we will still love it, and we'll still talk about it, and there'll still be another Chris Judd who's looking at the front of the bus or in the middle of the bus with his head in his hands. And it is for parents and for children and for teenagers themselves to say, who do I want to be like? And for the media to put all this energy into the negative stories and to fill their own pockets with it, really, is, that's the problem in society.
Well, it's 10 pages of the Herald Sun.
Yeah.
So imagine if they were just footballers. They have to be more than footballers in order to fill those 10 pages.
Yeah.
And might I say in 2025 or 2050 that we actually still have an administration of the AFL that's as good as the one that we currently have, because I fundamentally agree with you. I think they work incredibly hard, and they're trying to introduce sort of all these measures of social progressiveness. They have their anti-vilification laws, etc. And they, in some ways, were ahead of society in doing that.
The football AFL at the moment, I think it's doing an incredible job, and I think it's tough, and it's particularly tough because they're doing it in the spotlight. Like, to change all of these cultures and to somehow maintain the essence of football whilst bringing it up to date is really tough. I think it'll be a really difficult job.
Well, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you after the next scandal hits.
Yeah.
Thank you.